CSS Grid is one of the coolest features to hit CSS in years. If you've been putting off learning more about it, this is your perfect opportunity because I'm going to walk through 10 examples to teach you more about getting started with CSS Grid. So let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so what I've got set up here is, like I said, 10 different examples that we're going to build. This is in this GitHub repository that you have access to, a link in the video. Inside of each one of these examples, you have a start and a finish set of files. So the start and finish HTML is going to be basically the same. All of the structure, all the content is going to be inside of these HTML files. The difference is the CSS files that they referenced. The finished one is obviously finished, and the start one is empty. So that's where we're going to go and add all of our CSS to make these examples look the way they should. Now, if you're just getting started with CSS Grid, which I was in the last week or so, one of the best examples of learning CSS Grid or Flexbox or things like that is from CSS Tricks. So you can check out the complete guide on Grid from CSS Tricks. There's also a course by Wes Boss called CSS Grid that walks you through everything you need to know about CSS Grid with the examples as well. And then also a video by a friend of mine, Practical CSS Grid on Udemy, that I've gone through and learned from as well. So those are the examples that I've gone through in getting started. And now we'll go ahead and dive into doing our examples here. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I've got this project checked out in VS Code over here. And you can see with this starter, with the first project, I've got open the start CSS and start HTML. Inside of the HTML, I've basically just got 3 different grid items, which are the different colors that you can see in here. And so there's the red, there's the green, and there's orange with just some dummy text inside them. So we want to start by laying these out side by side. So we'll grab our grid container and we'll do a display of grid. All right, and nothing really changed there. So what we need to do is define the columns in our grid. So grid template columns, and we could do something like define three columns that are 100 pixels wide. That doesn't really look that great. What we want to do is take advantage of the available space. So this is where something called the fractional unit comes in, where what this means is each one of these will get a piece of the available pie that's out there. So the entire width that's available, each one will get a third of this. And then we can add quickly just a grid gap here by saying grid gap 20 pixels. So we're able to lay out these things side by side with a little bit of gap in between, which is really cool. We could take this one step further and we can add a media query, media, and we could say max width 786 pixels. What this means is these styles inside of this query will only be taken into account for screens less than or equal to 786 pixels. And when we do this, we just want to change grid template columns to be 1FR. And sorry, this is going to go inside of the grid container. So we want to select that first, and then inside of the grid container, set the grid template columns to 1FR. You can see that that went ahead and just put them on top of each other. Now, if we make this bigger, we should see when we hit the 786 mark, we get the side by side. And just so you can see this, let's open up our developer tools, and you can see the numbers up in the top right corner up here. And as they go down to what would be 786, you get the resizing. But because I am zoomed in to a higher percentage, it was actually doing it at a higher pixel. Now we can see if we scroll down to 786 pixels, we get this responsive grid, 3-column grid, really, really simple. The basic example of getting started with CSS Grid, which is great to start. And then you can combine that with a media query, basically to just kind of redefine the columns in your grid, and then they flow down like so. This is a very common technique where with more horizontal space, you have things laid out horizontally. And then once you scale down, or once the screen gets smaller, you basically stack them on top of each other. All right, really cool. Now let's open up example 2. And this one's going to be relatively simple. It's just going to be a centered piece of context. Now in CSS, without Flexbox and without Grid, centering something within a div was kind of difficult and got a little hacky. And with CSS Grid, we can do that a lot easier. So let's get some more room over here. Not trying to do a whole lot here, just like I said, trying to center that thing inside of a grid. So centered content, let's open up Start CSS and Start HTML. Inside of the HTML, we've got our grid container and then the content inside of it. So let's grab the grid container. And I want to make sure that it has a height to it. So I'm going to set the height to be 40 view heights and then the width to be 60 view width. I don't need it to take up the entire page. I just want to make sure that it takes up more space than the content that is inside. All right, so we save this and we'll see that does add the width and height to our element. And then we can also just center that thing in the page with the margin 0 auto trick. So all we've done is really just create the container for the elements that we want to center. So to be able to center items inside of a grid, you can call justify items center and then align items center if we've already put in display of grid. So now we should see that this actually centers the content. So by marking this as a display of grid, we're able to center things with justify items and align items. So what those both mean, justify items is to center your content horizontally. And you can see here, it doesn't take up the entire width. Usually block elements would, but since this is inside of a grid and we did justify center, it's going to only take up the amount of space it needs. Otherwise, it actually takes up the entire width. So by defining this as justify item center, that will only take up as much area as it needs and then center itself as well. And then align items will center this content vertically instead of horizontally. So by combining those two, you can center your stuff right inside of a div, which again, in CSS used to be kind of tricky. You'd have to do some hacks and things to get that to work. So now that's really handy to be able to use CSS Grid to center items inside of a div. All right, let's go down to 3. This one is actually pretty fun, I think. Let me open up 3 of the Start HTML, the CSS, and there's a little bit of JavaScript, which we'll talk about here in a second. And let's just look at the demo for 3. Let's go to finished. What this is if you start, let's make the screen bigger this way. You've got items 1, 2, 3, 4. They will reorder themselves as we scroll down to small sizes, or we can reorder them dynamically in JavaScript and see those reorder there by clicking the shuffle button. And that is by using the order property in CSS Grid. So that's what we're going to do now. All right, so let me make this a little bit smaller. Let's come over to our Start CSS. And first thing we want to do is just grab our grid container and do a display of grid and then a grid gap. We've seen this so far already, just to give some space between the elements. I think they have, oh, we need to go to our Start HTML. So now we'll see them here, and then the button doesn't have any style, so we can do that as well. I'm going to just grab the button properties here and just paste them in. Now this button should look like our finished one. All right, cool. All right, so just by marking this as display grid and adding a grid gap, we've got the items in line 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see in the HTML page here, those are actually in order, but they also have these classes assigned to item 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what we want to do is just try to get these to reorder themselves with CSS first, and then we'll add the functionality in JavaScript. So let's add a media query. We'll add a max width similar to what we did before. So anything lower than 786, we will now be able to do some styles based on those elements. So what if we took our item 1 and we set the order to 1, for example? That actually, oddly enough, is going to change the order. You would think defining order of 1 would actually put it at the first position, but because it's the only one that has a specified order, it's then going to come last. So we could do, to make this come first, we could do a -1, and there it'll come first. And you can kind of think of the rest of these items as having a default order of 0. All right. So then what we can do is just add, let's just copy and paste this 3 times. And let's grab 2 and 3 and 4. And let's just say our order is going to be 2, 0, 1, and 3. It doesn't matter. You can just choose whichever ones you want. And as I save this, notice now that they're in a different order. All right, so that works pretty cool. But if I go back to the bigger screen, it obviously just stays at the default order that it's in. So we're able to reorder content in CSS, no JavaScript yet, using CSS Grid. So now let's see how to do this in JavaScript. All right, so we want to get a reference to two things. We want to first get a reference to our button. So that thing, I've got a little shortcut here to get an element by ID. Shuffle button is what we want to call it. So that's what it's called, and that's what we're going to get. Then we want to get each of the items. So each of the items are the things in here that have a class of grid item. So to do that, we'll do document.query selector, if I can get that right, query selector all, and then we're looking for all the elements that have a class of grid item. The last thing we can do in here is, let's actually, since we're writing JavaScript, let's make this even a little bit bigger. Since we're querying all of these elements, what this returns is a node list. We can convert this to an array by using the spread operator, modern JavaScript syntax, to spread out each of these items into its own item in an array. So using the spread operator, now what we'll have is an array of all of the items. So we want to take our shuffle button, add an event listener. It's going to be a click event. And on the click, we want to iterate through each one of those items and then change the order property dynamically in JavaScript. So we can get all of our items and do a for each, and then get each item and decide what we want to do with it. So first, we need to get a random number, and we want a random number between 0 and 3. All right, so we'll do const random. And if you've ever done random numbers in JavaScript, you probably recognize this, but if not, it might be a little bit new. But we're going to use the random function on math. That's going to return a decimal between 0 and 1, including 0, but not including 1. Then we multiply that thing by 4. So we basically have a number between a decimal between 0 and 3.9999 up until not including 4. And so then we floor that to get the actual integer value. So this will give us a random number between 0 and 3. And then we basically just use that random number to be the order attribute of that given item. So we'll call set attribute, and we're going to set the style, and the style using ES6 template literals here. So we can use variables inside of the string, but we're going to set the order to the random variable if we use the template literal syntax successfully. So what this is basically defining a string that will have a variable interpolated inside of it. So it will actually set the order to the random number that we just set. So let's come over, let's click. Hopefully this works. As we click this, we get random color. So dynamically, we're able to tap into the order property in CSS Grid and go ahead and change that with JavaScript, which I think is pretty cool too. Sweet. So let's close all of these, and moving right along, we'll open up number 4. And 4 is a responsive navbar, which is really easy to do. It's kind of fun. Let's look at what this does. Our navbar here is on mobile. We'll just kind of stack the brand, the responsive nav title, on the list items. Otherwise, on bigger screens, it will put them out side by side. This is a pretty standard nav. You've probably seen this before. So let's grab not the finished versions of these, but the start and the start CSS and HTML, and close out the JavaScript file. And inside of the HTML, notice that we've got our nav. It's got one div for nav brand, and then the nav items themselves, or the nav items UL on order list has 3 items inside there. So let's grab our CSS, and the first thing we want to do is grab the nav and do a display of grid. Now we're going to have 2 columns in here, grid template columns. One is for the nav brand and one is for the actual nav items. So we want the nav brand to take up more space, basically as much space as it can outside of the space that the nav items are going to take up. So we can define one fractional unit and then auto. Auto is basically saying only take up as much space as you need. One FR says, all right, I'll grab the rest of the space. So let's look at this thing. If we go not to the finished example, but to the start, and we should see these things laid out. They don't look that good. The interesting thing about this, well, actually, let's do a couple things. Let's add color white. That'll help a little bit. And then padding inside of this nav, 20 pixels. So that looks good. We can also align. Notice that these things are not aligned vertically. We can align those, if you remember from one of our previous examples, by calling align items center. So this should at least align the content. And then now we need to go in and display these horizontally. One of the cool things that we can do is we can grab the nav items and we can use CSS Grid for it. So this is a grid embedded inside of a grid. We can do a grid auto flow column like this. And what this means is as we have extra items that don't fit into columns, instead of then generating more rows, just add on another column in the implicit grid. So we do this, and now we see that these things are side by side. Grid is laying that out for us. We could use the grid gap to give some spacing. That's going to lay it out. Now we just need to style these things like list items without styles, actually. So list style will be none, and then padding inline start will be 0 as well. So now we see this thing laid out basically how we expect. We could also style the nav brand, make this a little bit bigger. So font size 24 pixels and then font weight bold of 700. So now this looks good as a regular nav bar, but when you shrink, notice it gets a little bit ugly. That doesn't quite work. It's not too bad, honestly, but we can easily just kind of stack these two things on top of each other by redefining our grid. So let's do another media query, media max width of 786 pixels. All right, and what we want to do is select our nav, and we're just now going to redefine it to only have one column so that it automatically wraps everything else to the next column, or next row, excuse me. And then we will justify those things to be centered horizontally. So grid template columns is 1FR, and if we save that, we should see that now these things are just on one line. And then inside of here as well, to finish this out, we can justify the items, not content, items, center. All right, so there is the nav brand on top and then the nav items themselves. They still have their nice grid gap, which works nicely. All this stuff is centered horizontally and it is responsive when we get on bigger screens. Really cool. I like nav bars can be a little bit tricky to build, but using a couple of CSS Grid definitions in here, it gets a lot easier to make it responsive. So really cool. All right, so moving right along, that was example 4. Let's look at example 5. This is an asymmetric dashboard. Let's look at finished HTML. This is asymmetric in the sense that some items take up 2 columns, some take up 3. And as we shrink down, when we get on small screens, we basically just stack them all on top of each other. So let's open up the start HTML and then open it up in our code as well. Start HTML, CSS. In the HTML file, we've basically just got a dashboard here, and then we've got some grid items. Some of them are tagged with main, some of them are secondary. So the main elements are going to take up 3 columns, and the secondary are only going to take up 2. All right, so that's what we're going to work with. Let's open up the start CSS, and we will start by selecting our dashboard. As you can probably expect, we'll label this as display grid. We'll say grid template columns, and we want to have actually 6 actual columns. And the reason is if we want some of them to take up 3 and some of them to take up 2, but we still want to fill the available space, we need to have 6 total columns. And that way we can fit in a 3 and a 3 and then 2, 2, and 2. So instead of writing out 1FR 6 times, you can actually call the repeat function and pass it 1FR, or actually, excuse me, 6 times you want to repeat 1FR. So this will give us the 6 columns. And if we do that, we now should see these are listed in 6 columns. There's nothing in the 6th one because we only have 5 items. Cool. We can also add the grid gap. This is getting to be a pretty standard with us as well of 20 pixels. And we see those are spread out. Now let's try to take these and align them the way that we want. So inside of the CSS, let's grab the main and we want to define how many columns a main element should take. So grid column, instead of specifying a specific column, we just want to say span 3 different columns. So this should go ahead and take care of laying out 2 of them side by side, each of which are taking 3 columns. And then these secondary ones, we only want to take 2 columns. So we'll do the same type of thing. We can actually copy and paste this. And we'll do this as secondary and span 2 instead of 3. Cool, so this is not responsive yet, but this is asymmetric, where if you have anything that's asymmetric, you probably want to figure out how many different columns you need total. If you think about taking up half, or if you have 2 by 2 and then 3 by 3, you need 6 total columns to be able to make all those fit. So the last thing to do is make this responsive, and our typical media query, again, max width of 786 pixels. And wow, not that. We will select the dashboard, and we'll just define our grid template columns again as one FR, and they should all stack on top of each other. So if we shrink this down to 786, we see they go shrink all the way down, except for there's a little bit of a gap here. And the reason is if we hover over this, if we hover over, see if I can get onto the dashboard here. It's actually, Chrome is showing us those grid lines, and notice that the ones that are meant to take up 3 columns, the main ones on the top are taking up 3 columns, while the secondary ones are only taking up 2. So grid, because we define that many more columns, is forcing it to create those extra columns. And so to fix this, we can grab any element inside of our dashboard. So this star is any element inside of the dashboard, and just tell it to have a grid column span of 1, so that now they will all act the same and only take up 1 column. So we get this responsive asymmetric dashboard, which is good stuff as well. All right, so let's look at example 6. This is a asymmetric gallery layout. So let's look at the finished HTML here. This one was a lot of fun for me. I was actually working with my nephew, and he wanted to go with a New York City theme. And so what this is when we come out a little bit bigger, we can see we've got kind of a primary picture, and then some ones that go around the edges of it as well. And then when we go into responsive mode, they kind of stack on top of each other, with this one still being bigger, these 2 only taking up 1 column of 2. All right, this is probably going to need to be a little bit bigger to start. Let's grab the start HTML, and without CSS, this thing looks pretty terrible. So we'll go in and style it. Let's close out all of these extra files. We'll grab our start CSS and start HTML. And inside of our HTML, we have a grid container. Then we have a gallery image inside of the grid container. Inside of that div, it has the actual image itself as well as an overlay, and we'll show how to get those overlay effects when we hover. So we have several different of those. The top one is labeled as featured, which means that we want it to take up more space, and the bottom ones are just regular gallery items. Cool, so let's start with our grid container. You've seen this a couple times now. Display of grid gap 20 pixels. At our grid gap, and then we'll need to define our columns. So grid template columns, and we'll repeat 3 for 1FR. So this will put them kind of 3 side by side, but we haven't styled our images, so we're actually just taking up as much space as they want. We'll fix this in a second. And then we'll do our first time defining rows, and we want to have 3 rows here as well. And this will be 3 rows of 160 pixels. So doesn't look exactly like we want, so we need to go in and style those images as well. So let's grab each of the images, and let's set the height to be 100%. That way it'll only take up the 160 pixels, and then the width will be 100% as well. And then to make this look as best as possible, we'll set the object fit to 100%. So now if we look, this is pretty close to what our layout is, except we want our let's see where the style, our featured image to take up a little bit more space. So let's grab featured, and let's say the grid row is going to be 1, and then we want it to span 2 rows. So 1 and then span 2, and then the same thing for the column. We want it to start at column 1 and then span to as well. So let's look. That should take care of the basic layout. It's not responsive yet, so we'll do that here in a second. But we've got the layout here to make these kind of fit around it. So what happens is it finds this featured image. That featured image comes first in the list, so it would take this top left corner. Because it is defined to take up more space, it takes up its necessary space, and then the other ones just kind of fill in the gaps around it. So it actually works really nicely. So to make this responsive, let's do our media query, say max width 786 pixels. Let's grab our grid container again, and inside of here we'll define our columns, and in this case we want to have one FR, only 2 columns, and then our grid template rows will be 300 pixels high. All right, so each row will be 300 pixels high. Are we triggering that? There we go. All right, and looks like we're a little bit off here on the featured one, so we'll talk about that in a second. And for any additional row that's created, we want it to have 160 pixels. So we're only defining one row, which is 300 pixels high. And then the rest of the rows, the ones that are automatically created, we want to have 160 pixels. So if we look at this now, we still see our featured image is the biggest. And then these have a limited amount of height and then take up 2 widths as well. So that works pretty well. If we come over this way and then shrink down, that one still sits on top. These just kind of fill in on the bottom. All right, so that works really well. Now let's talk about this hover effect. And this is going to be kind of cool, I think, where let's start with just our overlay. So we've got that overlay inside of the gallery image. And just to show you that it is this thing, this anchor tag, so we can click on it in theory. And our overlay will be several things, but it will be position absolute. And we want this to take up the entire width and height of that image. So we'll set, I hate typing these out, so I'm going to copy and paste this. We'll set the top, left, right, and bottom all to 0. And unfortunately, that's going to have it take up the entire screen. The reason is our image needs to be set to position of relative. So let's target our gallery image, and we'll do 2 things: set the position to relative and the overflow to hidden. We'll talk about the overflow here in a second. So now what this should do is put our overlay to take up the entire width and height of the image that it's on. So you can see that is working, but it doesn't look that good. So we'll add a few more styles to it. We want this to be basically a transparent background or black background color. So we'll do RGBA, and we'll set it to 0, 0, 0, and then 0.5 as the alpha. That will add, as you can see, the dark color on top. We'll set the color to white. All right, so now the link should be white. And then to center that content, we've done this before. We can actually make this a display of grid and then align items center and justify items center as well. All right, so that should center that link. That looks pretty good. We can bump up the font size 18 pixels, for example, make it a little bit bigger. And that's getting pretty close. Now, what we want to do is we actually want to slide this thing off of the image so that we can't see it. So let's transform and translate Y and just translate it negative 100%. What that's going to do is put it, did that work? Transform, translate, negative, don't need 2 parentheses here, just 1. What that's going to do is take that overlay and just put it all the way up above the card. If we didn't hide the overflow, this would get really ugly, right? You see how the Ninja Turtles one is up here, the One World Trade is up here. The reason we're hiding the overflow stuff is so that we can push this thing off above the card and then slide it down and not see it while it's hidden. So as we add this transition, we will transition over 0.2 seconds when we transform. So the way we do that is we target our gallery image, and then the hover state for it, and then we want to apply something to the overlay itself. And what we'll do is we'll just transform and translate Y back to 0. So this is basically going to translate this, transform it back to 0. So if we hover, we get the slide effect in for the picture. We've got our cool responsive gallery, And we're able to use CSS Grid for the overlay to add the centering of the text. And you could go and customize this any way that you want. But I think this is a really, really cool demo of a couple of uses of CSS Grid combined with just some cool CSS stuff as well. So let's go into number 7 here is a responsive card gallery. And this one is fun because I have done this in a couple of videos, at least kind of the logic behind it, but we'll still talk about it here. Finished HTML, this is a responsive card gallery for Harry Potter characters. And if we go and shrink down, these things kind of shrink down in columns, and they happen all automatically. The tricky thing with some cards, and in this case, this situation, we don't know how many cards we're going to have, so we need to make them all fit well on the screen regardless. So let's open up the responsive card gallery, the start HTML. Let's open up that file over here, and the difference is start CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. Let's look at the HTML. There's basically nothing in there because we need to dynamically go and get these Harry Potter character information from an API. Let's start with just populating this unordered list of characters. So what we're gonna do is get a reference to the characters list by document get element by ID, and it is called characters list. And let's maximize this. And we'll create a function called load characters, which will be an async function. And if any of this JavaScript logic is tricky for you, I have a video that you can go and reference where we actually built this out from scratch, so I can spend more time on it there. And I'm gonna copy in this one request. That'll format, there we go. And what's wrong with our formatting here? We need to add a catch. And catch is going to be console error. All right, so what we're doing is we're making a fetch request to this API. This API will return us a list of Harry Potter characters. So that's the data that we get back. And with those characters, we want to take this response and actually convert it to that JSON response. And so we'll say const HP characters equals await res.json. So with the fetch API, we will await what it returns, we'll get that response, and then we'll convert that thing to get the JSON body out of it and then have it be here as the Harry Potter characters. Then we will call display characters by passing in the Harry Potter characters as you might expect. So then we need to define this function. So let's define the display characters, const display characters equals, and it's going to take in a parameter of characters. And inside of here, what we want to do, I'm just going to copy and paste this line in. Again, you've got a full video that you can check out if you need extra context for this, but I don't think it's the most important to write out right now. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking each one of these characters and we're generating an HTML string to represent that character. That HTML element will have it's a list item with a class of card. Inside of it, it will have a card image as well as card details. And then it will display that to the screen by setting the inner HTML of the UL, the characters list, to that string. Again, don't worry about this JavaScript too much. You can go and watch that video for reference. Main focus is going to be the CSS, but we've just got some stuff here to set it up. And so to start this off, we want to actually call the load characters function when the JavaScript is loaded. So what this becomes is hopefully now, let's see, it looks like we have an error. Inner HTML of null. Maybe we don't have our characters list. Characters list if we get spelled correctly. And now we see that all that Harry Potter information is coming back. So now we need to take these and style them. And as we have done in a couple of cases before, we're going to use CSS Grid in two ways. One, to lay out all the cards. And then secondly, inside of the card to lay out the image and the details for that card. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Inside of the start CSS, we'll have our gallery, and it's going to be a display of grid. And then we're going to do something really fancy here. Grid template columns is going to be a repeat, something called auto fit, and then a min max of 320 pixels, 1 FR. What this means, this is really fancy. What this means is we want to automatically fit as many cards as we can auto fit here on the screen, column wise, but we don't want a card to be less than 320 pixels. And then anything above that, just have it take up the available space. So we'll look at this and it actually works pretty cool. Or if we span this out, the images need to be fixed. But if we drag this out, we get more and more cards added as we can fit them on the screen. So a couple things we might want to do. Let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and style. Well, let's add a gap here. Grid gap 20 pixels. And then since this is an unordered list, we need to add padding, inline, start, none, and then list style, none. So this is just basic style, getting rid of the basic styling for list items. Then we'll grab our card. And I'm going to copy in a few things in here. So some of the boilerplate stuff. Here is a box shadow and a border, and then also a border radius and a transition. So I'll copy those in because that's not what we care about most. Now we can actually use the CSS Grid stuff to style this. So we'll do a display of grid, and then we'll have grid template columns, 1 FR and 3 FR. So this means that we want the image to only take up 1/4 of the available width, while the text will take up 3/4 of the available text, because the two children of a card is the image and then the details. All right, and then we'll also add a grid gap in there of 20 pixels. And you start to see this is looking close to okay, but our images are still taking up too much space. So we will grab each of these images. So card image, and then the image inside of it. We'll say height is going to be 160 pixels. Width will take up the available space that it has. Now these are starting to look a little bit better. We can do the object fit to cover, and just to show you, this is basically stretching the image to fill the available space. Instead, we can say, hey, just cover it, and it will it will basically kind of cover the available space and then some. So it'll make sure that whatever natural ratio it has, it will keep that same ratio and then stretch out to fill the entire space. So it looks a lot better there. There's this little gap here in some of these images that actually comes from images themselves. If they're not marked as display block, we'll have that little bit of gap there. And then let's see, anything else that we need to add? I think we're good. Then let's add the card title. I want to get rid of some of that space below. So margin bottom is 0. So now these are a little bit close together, but because of collapsing margins, now the margin of the detailed here is taking over as well. So let's grab the card details and let's set the margin top of it to just 5 pixels. So now this will put these closer together, but we want these things to be centered inside of the card. So if you remember how we did this before, we can call align items center. And now that information should be centered in the card. The image is nice and positioned. And then because we've got the auto fit, it'll put as many of these Harry Potter characters in the columns as can fit. Super, super cool example. A lot of fun, a little bit of JavaScript there, but you've got some extra resources to check out if you need to. All right, now let's get into a responsive 2-column with footer design. And this is a pretty standard one. So you see something like this, and then you scroll down and they all basically just stack on top of each other. We're going to build this one 2 different ways, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. So let's open up the begin page for this one, start columns and start. So notice it doesn't look that great there. Let's open up those starter files, the start CSS and HTML. And inside of the HTML, you can see we've got a grid container, we've got a header, we've got a sidebar, we've got a main content, and then we've got the footer down at the bottom. So let's go into our CSS, grab the grid container, display of grid on that to start, and then a grid gap of 20 pixels. And let's just see what this looks like. Well, this will put them all on top of each other, which is what we want on the small design. So on like mobile design, we want them to stack. And we're actually going to start with that as being the default. So far, we defined our defaults to be the way it should look on a desktop version, and then overridden it for mobile in media queries. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to do mobile first development, where that's all the definition we're going to have for our grid on mobile, and then we'll overwrite that with a media query. And instead of max width, this is going to be min width, 786 pixels. So these styles are going to be applied when the screen is greater than 786 pixels. And in that case, we'll do our grid container. We'll say it needs to have grid template columns. It's going to have 3 equally width columns. So repeat of 3, 1 FR. And as we make this bigger, this means they're all going to go. See if we did something, if we did it right there. If we can spell repeat and not repair, if that was the thing. So notice this is going to stack them all side by side. Now we need to determine which of these elements take up what amount of space. So let's start with the header. And we want it to take up the entire row. So it needs to span 3 columns. So we'll say grid column span 3. And you see that'll knock down the rest. And then the sidebar will only take up 1. So that kind of works by default. And then the main, we want to take up a 2 columns. So we want it to take up the rest of them. So let's grab our main and let's do grid column. And this will be a span of 2. And so now we get the sidebar and the main content working there. And then I'm going to copy and paste this header because the footer is going to do the same thing where we will have it take up all of this space down there. So we reverse the idea that we designed for mobile first, which is just stacking them. And then we override with details of how to do it on desktop. So if you hear mobile first, that's what we're talking about here, where you define your styles first for mobile and then overwrite for desktop. Cool. So in this next one, I don't need to bring up the final version because we're actually going to do the same thing, just in a slightly different way. So number 9 here, let's bring up Start CSS and HTML. Let's open up the number 9. And this is going to use something called grid areas, which allow us to reposition things really kind of in a cool way. So let's open up the Start HTML. And we will start off similarly by grabbing our grid container. Display grid gap 20 pixels, grid. Now this is the new part, grid template areas. All right, and this is going to look weird. We've got a header, and then we've got a sidebar, and then we've got the main, and then we've got the footer. So what we're doing here, and this is going to format it for me, we're defining areas in our grid. And this is basically the definition of just stacking stuff on top of each other, but we've given a name to each position. So header, sidebar, main, and footer. And then for each of our elements, header, for example, if we start here, header is going to have the grid area of header, and main will have the grid area of main. And you can probably see where this is going. Grid area for footer is going to be footer. And then the sidebar will have a grid area of sidebar. Now, you probably notice nothing in here looks different. That's because, again, we're mobile first. So we define our different areas, which are just stacked horizontally on each other with only 1 column. We'll see how we change that in a second. Now, in our media query, we can change this. Let's do a media and say a min width of 786 pixels. What we want to do is now grab our grid container and redefine the grid template areas. And you'll see how powerful this becomes by just assigning something to an area and then redefining it. So I'm going to go ahead and put it on this bigger one so you'll see it change. And now we want grid template areas, and we'll start with header, header, header. And if you're wondering why we are repeating this, what this means is the header will take up all 3 of these columns. All right, so that's on the first row. The second row will be sidebar and then sidebar and then main, main. So sidebar will take 1 column, main will take 2, and then the bottom will be footer, footer, footer. And now just by saving this file, by redefining the grid template areas, everything just kind of jumps to place. And then on the mobile takes advantage of just stacking on top of each other. So grid template areas is a really, really neat and powerful way to define areas for your grid in just basically like the language that you're used to. Then assign your different elements to those areas, and then you can redefine your grid template areas how you need. So I think that one is really, really cool. So last example in here is example 10, which is a checkered board layout, which I enjoy as well. So this is a checkered board. It's kind of this like 2x2s that lay out on top of each other. And then when they scroll down, we want them to stack on top of each other. But notice one of the challenges here is the order of these. The image comes first in this one, but it comes second in this one. But using grid order, when we scale down, we can make sure that the image comes first for each of them. So that's going to be something we have to keep in mind. So let's grab our start HTML. Let's close out all of our open windows. Let's open those two files in here. All right, so we've got inside of here, we've got a row for each of these checkerboard items, and it's got an image tag in it, and then a row details for each one with a title and a paragraph tag. So that's what we're going to be working with. We want to start with our .row. We want to mark it as display grid, as you might expect. We will have two columns, the grid template columns, and this will be one FR and one FR. And so this will put them side by side. The image is still going to bleed over, so we need to fix that. And then let's set the color of white to make sure that that text stands out. So now you see the text here doesn't look great because our images need to conform to the space that they have. So let's grab the row image, set the width to 100%. And now we're starting to see this look a little bit better, but we need some height. So let's set the height of these to 400 pixels. Now we're getting really close. The image is going to look a little bit off. Now we can use our object fit to cover as well. So now we see we've got our checkerboard layout, which looks pretty good. Now we need to make it responsive. We can also add for the details, the row details, we can add some padding to make, give that a little bit of breathing room. And we've got the general layout here. And so now we'll come in to our media query. We'll do a media query max width of 786 pixels. We'll grab our, not grid area, but row, and then reset the column, so grid template columns to just one FR. So this is basically want to stack everything on top of each other. But the problem is when we do this, when it shrinks down, we see the image comes and then the text, and then the second one, because of the order, the text comes and then the image. So if you remember back to how we changed orders dynamically in CSS and JavaScript in one of the earlier examples, we can set the row property for the row image and just set the grid row to -1. This means it's always going to, in mobile, inside of this these styles, it's always going to come first. So let's select that and then scroll to the top, and just to show again the responsiveness, here's the checkered board, and then come down, and now the order switches where the image is always first, which I think is really cool and a lot of fun. So in recap, I spent the last week really looking into CSS Grid. It was new for me. I really wanted to challenge myself to play around with it, and I created these examples. I hope that you enjoyed them. I hope that you got something out of them. So question of the day, are you using CSS Grid? How long have you been using it? What's your favorite feature of Grid? And do you have anything that you can share that is a really cool demo of CSS Grid? But that's going to wrap it up for this video. As always, if you enjoyed the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you can get notified as the most recent content comes out. But in the meantime, I will see you in the next video.